And it's a great honor to be here on this panel with these two great academics. Michael Dawson from the University of Chicago, whose first two books, Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African American Politics, and Black Visions, The Roots of Contemporary African American Political Ideologies, have won multiple awards. His recent books include Not in Our Lifetime, The Future of Black Politics, and Blacks In and Out of the Left. Recently with Megan Ming Francis Dawson, he has launched a nationwide multi-university project to study the intersection of race and capitalism. And there's still more in your leaflets if you want more details. There's plenty more to be said about both of these very accomplished people. Our other speaker today is Michael Hanchard, who is professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the Marginalized Populations Project. His books include Orpheus and Power, The Movimento Negro of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Party Politics, Horizons in Black Political Thought, and most recently, The Spectre of Race, How Discrimination Haunts Western Democracy. So we will hear their two papers, and we'll just proceed as everyone else has. The time, remind me of the time.
20 minutes.
20 minutes each, and then we'll have about a half an hour for questions.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon. Week. Thank you, Bonnie, and like everyone else, I want to thank Juliet, Melvin, and Michelle, and everyone who's put together this amazing conference. It's truly an honor to participate. Today I would like to sketch, the title of my paper is Racial Capitalism, Articulated Systems of Domination and Democratic Crisis. I apologize to those of you who waited through the massive, which is going to be 2 chapters, but after 90 pages seem to be a little excessive for one paper. Today I would like to sketch a developing framework to the study of race and capitalism pulled from a book on racial capitalism, being co-authored with Megan Ming Francis, and a series of articles being co-written with Emily Koshenstein. These work draw on our individual and joint work on Black history, politics, and Black political thought. I should emphasize this is radically a work in progress, and we don't yet all agree as to the best formulation of the points I'll try to make during my presentation. I use this framework to offer some reflections on the relationship between racial capitalism and the current democratic crisis found within the United States and many other places. I start with an insight by Du Bois about democracy in the US. Nearly a century ago, Du Bois pinpointed the true American dilemma. Quote, the true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. What were to be the limits of democratic control in the United States? If all labor, Black as well as white, became free, were given schools and the right to vote, what control could or should be set to the power of these laborers? Was the rule of the mass of Americans to be unlimited and the right to rule extended to all regardless of race and color? Or if not, what power of dictatorship and control, and how would property and privilege be protected? Unquote. As Du Bois argued in Black Reconstruction and other places, the eventual answer was the co-opting of poor and working class whites into active collaboration, and James Boggs will argue a generation later, material beneficiaries in a system of white supremacy. Democracy and mass prosperity would be exchanged for a racist dictatorship that ultimately led to first hundreds of thousands of poor whites shedding their blood during the Civil War on behalf of large-scale slave owners. They made the same choice when they abandoned the progressive potential of the populist movement, once again for white supremacy and the racist dictatorship of Jim Crow. They made the same choice when they made the same choice during the 2016 national election. We're in the beginning stages of a dangerous new period of economic and racial crisis, a legitimacy crisis engendered by the rapaciousness of financial capitalism and the subsequent breakdown of the deal where some of the super profits expropriated from internal and external colonies were transferred to the predominantly white middle class and a segment of the white working class. Trump's candidacy is a symptom of the breakdown, as I've argued, of this bargain. where white and male privilege would be combined with a small share of the economic spoils of super exploitation and colonial expropriation for a class peace, at least among whites, in the U.S. and elsewhere. Particularly in the time of crisis as we now see, appeals are made to citizens of European descent that look backwards with nostalgia to a time in the U.S. where blacks and others supposedly knew their place and white supremacy seemed unchallengeable. That such a time never existed does not take away from the power of these political appeals. This nostalgic but false fantasy not only erases a history of black struggle, but also of various working class and other progressive struggles. It's a fantasy that's also shared by too many of the black neoliberal elite, who also views as anachronistic blacks who insist on naming and resisting the structural forces of dominance that produced disadvantaged black communities. Historically, this crisis has its roots in a time when the standard of living plummeted for many of those who benefited from this system, as white supremacy and colonialism became increasingly challenged domestically and internationally. As Greta Krippner, among others, has argued, a fiscal crisis was provoked as the state could not simultaneously meet its obligations as those who had been excluded began to make politically effective demands while also under pressure from various external shocks. Yet it's highly debatable that black communities are perceiving the current situation the same way, as black death and oppression is a continuing fact of life in the face of a definition of crisis. Lauren Berlant is persuasive when she argues against, quote, calling a crisis that which is in fact of life and has been a defining fact of life for a given population that lives it as a fact in ordinary time, unquote. That was published over a decade ago, and as I've argued, the language of crisis as applied to whites in the U.S. is appropriate, given the accelerated deterioration of their material lives of many working class white Americans, combined with the erosion of white and male privilege. Yet despite the even more desperate circumstances of people of color, which adheres Berlant's warning as the disposability, exploitation, expropriation, and violence these communities suffer, is all too routine. My colleagues and I argue that the source of the crisis can be found in the articulation of three systems of domination: the capitalist social order, white supremacy, and patriarchy. While closely articulated, they have their own internal logics that include the sources of resistance to each system of domination. The potential for cross-system ruptures is a lesson that black political history continues to press on one. Not only do blacks and our allies continually resist white supremacy, victories that not only reshape but finally undermine white supremacy are won, even if inevitably the price is paid is an enormous one of blood and sacrifice. Given the interlocking of white supremacy and capitalism, victories in one domain have the potential, too often unrealized, to undermine the other system of domination. One potential consequence, for example, of the expansion of debt and soaring of economic inequality in the global north, to Gilded Age levels that is accompanying the securitizing of the economy is already being felt politically. Conflicts over race and gender privilege that led to the type of raw nationalism that led to Trump and the right we're suing in Europe are a result of these crises. While there's obvious authoritarian potential, there's also rebellion against further reduction of state benefits, such as health care, as we saw on Tuesday, among the very populations that are susceptible to racist, sexist, and nationalist appeals. In this period of democratic crisis and rapidly rising violent racialized authoritarianism, we must ask what are the institutional arrangements necessary to secure not just a return to what's been, for most, a semi-democratic regime, but full democracy and justice for all, including those who have never been fully included in either the economic or political aspects of an already weak democracy. This question leads to the question of whether full black liberation can be achieved within the framework of a capitalist social order. In the black radical tradition, there's been a long-standing debate about the extent to which a liberal capitalist order is ever capable of accommodating the demands of black emancipatory movements. From the early 20th century through the 1970s, there was a fierce debate among black radicals whether black liberation could be achieved within a capitalist social order. Those in the early 20th century, such as the African Blood Brotherhood and the black members of the CPUSA, insisted that black liberation was unachievable under capitalism, a position that organizations such as the Black Panther Party and the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement echoed a generation ago. generation later, excuse me. James Boggs, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s argued that the marginalization and impoverishment of black spaces was inseparable from a capitalist order. Quote, "We cannot look at the underdevelopment of the black community separately from capitalism, any more than we look at the development of racism separately from capitalism," unquote. Boggs insisted that the elimination of economic and racial injustice required the dismantling of capitalism, not fuller and more equal participation within the capitalist order. According to Boggs, the racialized distribution and control of wealth and the means of production could not be resolved within a system governed by profit maximization. He foresaw a continued exploitation of the precarious economic situation of black communities, first and foremost, but not exclusively in the labor market. Thus for Boggs, as for many in the black radical tradition, capitalism itself is the barrier to overcoming white supremacy. He therefore argued that black liberation required the, quote, "social ownership and control by the black community," unquote, of land, property, the means of production, distribution, and communication. He also thought about new and, at the time, experimental economic forms. One need not agree with Boggs's conclusion to share his contention that the capitalist order had reinforced racial hierarchies and a racialized distribution of wealth in the United States, and is unlikely to provide the tools to overcome the marginalization and impoverishment of black communities without fundamental changes to the economic order. More recently, scholars have sought to engage with this contestation on a more granular level to explicate the ways in which white supremacy and a capitalist social order are mutually reinforcing. Racial hierarchies can be mobilized, of course, in order to secure entry to markets, redistribute property both by legal means and by extra-legal violence, and maximize profitability in capitalist markets. As Ida B. Wells and many other late 19th, early 20th century black activists and writers documented, the naked violence of Jim Crow from both the state and white citizens was used to dispossess black individuals and communities. This has occurred variously through brutal violence, including lynchings and pogroms, such as the 1921 attack on Tulsa, Oklahoma's black community, or confiscation and fraud, both backed by the racial state. The racial state has often backed the racial segmentation of markets, including housing, labor, and credit markets. This has exacerbated the wealth gap and has led to the super exploitation of particularly precarious situation of black and brown labor. Mario Barrera, writing a generation ago, for example, has argued that black and brown labor forces were particularly vulnerable, not least because they were often excluded from organized labor, and thus constituted a segment of the population that could be used as a disposable reserve army. This reserve army could be laid off easily during a slack economy and paid substandard wages when employed. White supremacist logic enabled super exploitation by ensuring that white workers would be less likely to feel class solidarity with black and brown workers, thus allowing levels of disposability and wage suppression that would be unachievable otherwise. A substantial body of the scholarship that has focused on the ways in which racial hierarchies can be functional for capitalist orders has argued that the term racial, this is Jody Melamed, building on the work of Cedric Robinson, has argued that, quote, "the term racial capitalism requires its users to recognize that capitalism is racial capitalism. Capitalism is only capital when it's accumulated. It can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Procedures of racialization and capitalism are ultimately never separable from each other," unquote. We value this point of view and take the concept of racial capitalism as a starting point. We seek here to elaborate an analytical framework that focuses on the various configurations of the nexus of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. We argue for an approach to racial capitalism, as we would prefer race and capitalism, that embraces the ideal of a system of domination that is mutually articulated. As Anne McClintock argued, quote, "no social category exists in privileged isolation. Each comes into being in social relation to other categories, if in uneven and contradictory ways. Since race, gender, and class are categories that come into existence in and through relationship to each other, they can be called unarticulated categories," unquote. Unlike McClintock, however, we talk about mutually articulated systems of domination rather than social categories. Each such system of domination has its own effect in producing subordinate racialized communities independently and in articulation. The articulation of these three systems of domination does not, however, produce, we argue, a totalizing system of domination. Instead, there are multiple configurations of interaction and mutual articulation, and analysis thereof is a prerequisite for the elaboration of viable political strategies. We do so in order to theorize the contradictions that aid and hinder progressive political mobilization as results of partially conflicting sets of privileges and oppressions, in turn help us explain historically contingent patterns of conflict and cooperation among various social groups. Even though racial hierarchies can and often are not only compatible with, but often reinforce capitalism, there are also moments in which white supremacy and capital develop antagonistic tendencies. For example, historian Dustin Jenkins shows us how the policies pursued by white Alabama elites during their successful attempt to overthrow Reconstruction were detrimental to their successors functioning in the capital markets of the early 20th century. We call the specific articulation between the three systems of domination for a given era a regime of articulation. Historically, these regimes became established with the twin crimes of the global dispossession and genocide of indigenous peoples, and then enslavement and commodification of African bodies through the slave trade. This articulation had different consequences for men and women, and for different consequences for men and women of different races and ethnicities. For example, as Angela Davis, Patricia Hill Collins, Adia Hartman, and Hortense Spillers and others had demonstrated, slavery transformed the content of gender for black women. Reproduction for black women meant that they were not only themselves commodities and capital, the main producer of capital. For as Walter Johnson has shown, quote, enslaved people were capital. Their value in 1860 was equal to all of the capital invested in American railroads, manufacturing, and agricultural land combined. Violence by the racial state, by slave owners, and by any white person who so chose was the glue that ensured the terror and exploitation continued uninterrupted. All three systems of domination intersected to define the content of gender and race during this era. This approach allows one to understand what are the specific mechanisms within capitalism during a specific era that interact, articulate with patriarchy and white supremacy to produce injustice within disadvantaged black communities. For example, the Jim Crow era within the U.S. was marked by the super exploitation of black and brown labor and periods of increased, sometimes violent attacks on black workers and their communities by white workers, as well as all too brief periods of interracial solidarity. By identifying Jim Crow super exploitation, the fundamental aspect of black oppression during that era, we would have to theorize what type of a rearranging of labor markets and other economic and political institutions would lead to justice for black workers in the official labor force. Yet by also asking how gender articulates with both class and race during Jim Crow will also lead us to ask what type of economic and familial arrangements would lead to justice for the large number of black women employed in domestic work during that era, as well as the unwaged work, including care work that primarily women did and do inside of the home. In conclusion, what are some of the political implications of applying this regimes of articulation approach to analysis of what many have termed racial capitalism? First, it means that we need to analyze the current articulation of the three systems of domination in order to identify weak points in the mutual articulation that makes gains for emancipatory movements possible. Second, the regimes of articulation approach, insofar as it recognizes that the mutual articulation of white supremacy and capitalism have been relatively stable historically, means that we are more pessimistic, and I'm not using the imperial we, I'm talking about me and my co-authors, about the viability and possibility of relying on state-based solutions to the problems of marginalized communities of color. We argue there should be a greater emphasis on solutions that foster economic and political autonomy of black communities. We argue that the concept of self-determination is the political principle that best captures our concern about preserving the autonomy and agency of black communities. Black communities have the opportunity to choose which institutional arrangements and political strategies best fit these communities' needs, and third, democratize the economy, not just putatively civil society. Self-determination, we contend, should extend to economic as well as the political realms. We argue that the predations generated by the articulation of the three systems of domination requires black communities to seek innovative economic forms that allow more local control over economic processes. It requires an open experimental discussion about the political economy of black liberation. In particular, we should consider whether current economic institutions can be made just, both in the distributive sense, can they eradicate racial economic inequality as well as economic inequality in general, and the emancipatory sense. Can they bring about a form of work that's both meaningful and autonomous in a significant sense? Struggles against the disadvantaged and oppression of these communities, after all, are not simply distributive struggles. They also challenge the powerless and dependence of communities, the fact that they are not equal partners in the demos, and can therefore not participate in regulating and steering the economy on an equal basis. This reality provides the ground for a demand for economic self-determination, including the potential for demanding economic autonomy. The demand for self-determination also has contained within it radical democratic possibilities. The demand interpolates blacks within the U.S. to come together to debate their future, debate what are the sources of their oppression, how they should organize, who are their allies, and how should the economy, the state, and civil society be organized in order to achieve a consensuous understanding of the good life, debate what type of world we need and want to make. Thus, the call for self-determination contains within it a call to debate how to overthrow the social order of white supremacy, whether capitalism can be reformed sufficiently to ensure justice for blacks and other subordinated populations, and whether patriarchy is necessary, as some black liberal and nationalist groups claim, to healthy black communities, or as we believe is another vicious and unjust system of domination akin to capitalism and white supremacy, as black feminists and some black liberals, nationalists, and leftists. From this perspective, the call for self-determination is an ethical call that demands that an oppressed people take their future into their own hands, democratically debate what future and ensuing politics self-determination demands. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Juliet Hooker and Melvin Rogers for inviting me to this event, giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. Is that more closer? Okay. And also to Michelle Rose for her logistical support in getting all of us here. What I'm going to present is the more pared-down version of what I had. All right, thank you. More pared-down version of what I submitted in order to get the main points across in this talk, and also for my new book. So today I'm going to make some claims about democracy that will be considered to many ears counterintuitive, if not outright wrong. In various locales of the contemporary world, the trampling of rights of groups and individuals because of religious, ethno-national, gendered, or presumed racial differences has become depressingly commonplace. For many observers, ethnic cleansing, xenophobia, and religious intolerance are characteristics of non-democratic countries and regimes. But when such phenomena can be found in nominally democratic societies and polities, how do you distinguish democratic societies from non-democratic ones? My aim here is to briefly illuminate the ideologies, popular and institutional practices which, though often considered anathema to democracy's practice, are actually embedded within democratic polities. In this brief set of comments, I will emphasize three key concepts which will hopefully enable the audience to distinguish democracy as a philosophical concept from democracy as a set of practices with a specific set of actors, institutions, and motivating logics. Rather than associate democracy with a set of assumptions that are more hagiography than actual history, I'll focus on the dynamic relationships between democratic subjects on the one hand and those who have occupied the space and territory, if not the same juridical, deliberative, and legislative domains as its citizens. Point one, most, if not all democracies, beginning with the first, has operated within an ethnos, a complex of laws, customs, and norms, and often, when necessary, coercive and exclusionary practices designed to privilege certain populations and not others. Point two, homogeneity has long been an underlying principle or assumption in the most robust, most continuous democratic polities in the world. Namely, a tendency for governments and key political actors to believe that the ideal society, one prone to less political misfortune and mishap, is one where the demographic constitution of government is identical or close to identical with that of the government. Rather than focusing on either lone gunmen, members of far-right organizations who can be labeled at the level of the individual as sociopaths, evil, or psychotic, I would like to suggest that it's important to understand the imaginaries, dreams, even hopes of these rabidly racist organizations and individuals in order to understand the motivations of their collective imagination. I'd like to suggest that exploring myths of autochthony and the desire for homogeneity as objectives in their fantasies and in their violence. Backdrop, classical Athens. On the eve of the white nationalist demonstrations and counter-protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, on August 14, 2017, right-wing nationalists, fascists, and Nazi sympathizers gathered in front of several monuments to the Confederacy that had been targeted for demolition. The chilling, well-rehearsed chant will be familiar to those who viewed the video footage compiled by the reporter embedded in a crowd of mostly, though not exclusively, white male nationalists who marched through the streets with torches, shouting in unison, "Blood and soil, we will not be replaced. The Jews will not replace us." One of the spokespeople who received the most attention for several days after the events revealed to an interviewer his dream of an ethno-state, presumably a nation state in which the governed and the government were racially unified. Yet the indications of such white racists in Charlottesville also contain echoes or elements of an older, ancient series of associations, which, as we have discovered, can be traced back to classical Athens in the 5th century BCE, of blood and soil. In 2017, these white nationalists proclaimed their inheritance not only of the soil of the United States, but the polity as well, notwithstanding the fact that Jews, blacks, Latinos, and others prohibited from sharing the ethno-state could make similar claims to be of the same blood and soil. Their very language of replacement suggested that the hope for a polity of white nationalists was one in which citizens were born, not made. No amount of religious conversion or socialization could compensate for the inherent limitations of the excluded roots. There are limits to drawing parallels between 2017's events and classical Athens, between the exhortations of fascists and neo-fascists, with the intellectuals, playwrights, and citizens of Athens regarding the most preferable form of political life. Yet several formal and substantive parallels can be drawn in a more generalizable consideration of the relationship between myth and politics. In the classical period, Athens fought off several invasions by outsiders, most notably the Persian army, and instituted criteria designed to restrict and limit citizenship to true Athenians, literally the citizens of the soil. Pericles' citizenship law of 451 required dual Athenian parentage for citizen status. Additionally, descent-based citizenship was also underpinned by an origin narrative which proclaimed that the early king of Greece, Erythonios, actually descended from the earth. Subsequently, citizenship criteria became based upon the premise that the first citizens of Athens literally sprang from the earth, and their successors were descended from those citizens who emerged from the soil. What made the political use of autochthony here unique was that its definition was based in mythology, not fact. The belief that Athenian citizens after the Persian War were the offspring of people who literally sprang from the soil. Human beings, as we know, coming through existence through procreation. People become citizens through politics, not nature and certainly not the soil. Secondly, the linkage of autochthony, blood and soil, with citizenship, whether in Athens, Nazi Germany, or the contemporary United States, ultimately entails a disenfranchisement of the extant group of citizens and a categorical exclusion of groups of people who would otherwise be eligible for citizenship. This political mythology served to naturalize citizenship, making it inaccessible to those who cannot prove that they are descended from Athenian soil. Additionally, since citizenship had become patrilineal, a woman, even one descended from autochthonous parents, could not become a citizen, nor could slaves nor foreigners. So in this sense, autochthonous criteria for political membership also served as a form of immigration policy, excluding the majority of non-Athenians from citizenship. Right? Now, I'm going to skip over some of this for the sake of time. The exclusion of slaves, women, medics, who are often foreign-born, Aristotle among them, from citizenship does not negate the uniqueness of the Athenian democratic experiment. It does, however, complicate our reception of democracy's relation to political and economic equality. rather than view democracy as a precondition of equality, could it be that social and political inequality is a prerequisite of democracy? Thus, one key lesson to remind ourselves in this conversation is how the entwinement of democracy and inequality can be found within processes and outcomes of democratic deliberation is in the following sense. Democratic deliberation, judgment, and action does not guarantee that democratic outcomes await those of the object of deliberation. Right? In that case, I'm talking about slaves. It is important to remember the following about Athenian democracy. As a complex of institutions and citizens and laws, it was not designed to incorporate all inhabitants into the territory where democracy resided, but only within the polity, right? In relation between citizens and government. Moments of geopolitical crisis, such as that experienced by the Greeks during the Greco-Persian Wars, the contemporary moment in the United States, with the hysteria over the looming presence of Central and Southern American immigrants headed towards the southern border of the United States, or the contemporary debates in the EU over migration, reveal popular and governmental anxieties about being overrun by certain, not all, foreigners. In these selective, racialized, and ethnicized citizenship regimes, citizenship becomes associated with particular types of people, and not the actual exercise of citizenship rights, duties, and responsibilities. So the more popular understanding of democracy as a way of life in which all in its vicinity are equal members is not intrinsic to the first instantiation of democracy, but we can more associate it with the rise of republicanism and nationalism at two distinct historical moments, roughly between 1789 to the third decade of the 19th century, and between approximately 1945 and 1970, right? In other words, democracies have always maintained a sharp distinction between members of their societies, the people who simply live there, and members of their polities, the people who actually influence the political process. As democratic institutions maintain barriers to civic membership, they must always justify that exclusion. One of my claims here is that the race concept became the modern equivalent of autocracy in many Western and Western-influenced nation-states. As key variables in the development of citizenship and immigration regimes, policies of education and socialization, the race concept and the ensuing hierarchies premised upon it became the basis for what I've conceptualized as racial regimes, which provided the means to institutionalize and rationalize hierarchies premised upon some perceived somatic and phenotypic distinctions, which themselves were based upon faulty ideas of biological or geographical origins. Slaves across time and space have rarely had a say in the injustice of their enslavement, regardless of whether the decision to enslave them was the result of democratic deliberation or not. And now I want to talk about what I call the new autochthonous, and this speaks to the contemporary moment. The myth of the new autochthonous, like earlier versions in much of the EU, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States, is to make the racial imaginary coterminous with the civic imaginary. The central problem these acted upon desires would require is the removal, marginalization, or eradication of those excluded from participation in the polity. The disenfranchisement of a portion of any citizenry would have echoes in other times and places, and would entail significant costs, political, social, moral, psychological, to white nationalists and opponents alike, in the effort to remake any society along these lines. The quest for homogeneity is necessarily a rejection of the individual, and a very impoverished understanding of what people refer to as an identity. The pursuit by xenophobes and nationalists of various sorts of homogeneity is the underlying rationale for many, though not all, immigration policies, based upon the belief somehow that racial, religious, or ethno-national homogeneity will somehow beget unanimity, and thus the obsolescence of politics. I want to give you a quote which in some sense underscores this, and this is taken from Woodrow Wilson's 20th President of the United States, an unpublished manuscript which its editors described as a precursor to his book, The State. The earlier version was called The Modern Democratic State, right? And here Wilson details what he describes as several all-important conditions for the successful operation of democratic institutions. Number one on his list, quote, homogeneity of race and community of thought and purpose among the people. There's no amalgam of democracy which can harmoniously unite races of diverse habits and instincts or unequal acquirements in thought and action. A nation once coming to maturity and habituated to self-government may absorb even alien elements, as our own nation has done and is still doing. Ellipsis. Homogeneity is the first requisite for a nation that would be democratic. Thus, when considered historically, which means further back than the last election or a generation ago, there is an eerie resonance in the pronouncements of many governmental leaders of contemporary and recent political history, and the language of heroin-evoked racism. For example, not too long ago, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives made the following statement. I believe that possibly statistics would show that the Western European races have made the best citizens in America. They are, he continued, more easily made into America. And I would draw this out, but for sake of time, I'll give you the punchline already. These words were uttered by one Dr. John Travers Wood, a Republican congressional representative from Idaho in 1952, to lend his voice to those in favor of amending U.S. immigration policy by lowering quotas for non-white immigrants or migrants coming to the United States. His argument should ring familiar to most people paying attention to immigration policy in the Trump era. Trump administration's ban on all Muslims coming from select countries, its separation of families along the U.S.-Mexico border, or the president's reference to black immigrants coming from shithole countries, represent in some fun way a continuity rather than a break with the past. In terms of policies and sentiments, which often reveal forms of religious, racial, ethno-national practices squirming within U.S. immigration legislation. Right? The countries I've alluded to above, as well as many others, face the same problem, however, when invoking some glorified, unified racial and ethno-national past. And this is for the kind of the stake in the diagonal of the autochthonies. Right? That there were always other peoples in their midst. People had to be assimilated or incorporated into the nation state. And when that proved politically, culturally, or economically unfeasible, removed, pacified, or exterminated. This is the history of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a host of other places. What I'm suggesting here is that the ethnos of democracies may be as much a part of the problem, and not the seamless solution to problems of political and economic inequality in the modern world. The lesson I'd like to emphasize here for our contemporary moment is that population homogeneity, like the category of foreigner and citizen, is a political artifact, not something we find ready-made in the world, not something that ever existed. So much of the origin tales told by various ultranationalists and xenophobic movements in nation states rely on stories and genealogies of themselves, mythical. Right? And this, in some sense, can be boiled down to their responses to the following questions. By what criteria should we allow some people and not others to settle in a society? In answering this question, policymakers and the average citizen may do well to consider the possibility that democracy itself, right, as historically and politically practiced, does not have the answer that we would hope or think that it would have. I would avoid, for the sake of time, got a number of examples I will talk about. I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Right? Okay. Certainly, racial and ethno-national hierarchy are not the only ways in which we can track the evolution and emergence of institutional development and variation. But racial and ethno-national hierarchy in modern politics provides many opportunities to examine the emergence and development of institutionalized racism in the form of what I've called racial regimes. The existence of racial and ethno-national regimes in democratic polities enables scholars to consider broader, more abstract questions about the entanglements of citizen, society, and polity. Under what conditions does democracy require barriers to membership? Could it be that even under the most practical conditions for the elaboration of democratic and republican ideals, a subordinated laboring majority population with limited or non-existent political rights was necessary for the functioning of democracy for the few. So what I've tried to underscore here in conclusion is how the quest for homogeneity and democracy have been intertwined in the same political project, the project of nation-state, the conjunctive nation-state, and how racial ethno-national hierarchy has operated in a nation-state system as a filter for citizenship, and thus access to economic as well as political privilege. The two assumptions under this talk, the quest for homogeneity and the utilization of democratic practices and institutions to privilege citizens and disadvantage non-citizens, are often combined by governments and nationalists during moments of perceived or actual crisis to further marginalize those populations in a society who are considered either unworthy of participation in polity or more severely excluded from society altogether. How successful right-wing populist movements and ultimately governments are in not only combining these two assumptions, but transforming their ideas into institutions, provides one way to trace the contours and limits of democracy in the contemporary world. Thank you.